Well, Lincoln didn't have much naval experience. He had gone down to New Orleans a couple of times on a flatboat. He had a patent lifting a boat over a shoal, so he knew a little bit about water. But here you are, the author of Lincoln as Commander-in-Chief, and we spoke about that last time we were here. But how was he as Admiral-in-Chief? Did he study the Navy and its tactics and strategy as much as he did the Army?
Not at all. He once said that I know little about ships. And so he turned over responsibility for the Navy to his very talented Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Welles, who turned out to be a first-rate appointment, even though he had very little previous experience connected with the Navy, and Gustavus Fox, who was a former captain in the United States Navy. They basically ran the Navy. Lincoln also befriended John Dahlgren, who was the chief of ordnance and also head of the Washington Navy Yard at the outset of the war, and eventually became an admiral and commanded the fleet that tried to capture Charleston.
That friendship may have led to Dahlgren's son's death. That's a different story.
That's a different story, but it may well have. That's quite true.
And Lincoln's as well, by the way.
Yes, according to come retribution, that's quite true. In any case, Lincoln was content to turn control of the Navy over to these people, and because they did such a good job, he didn't have to spend all the time worrying about the Navy that he did with the Army. Although Samuel Francis DuPont by 1863 turned out to be a kind of McClellan type, up until that time he had been very much in charge of the South Atlantic blockading fleet and did a good job with it. But Lincoln didn't have to deal with the kinds of problems that occupied thousands of hours of his time with the Army of the Potomac and some other armies, but primarily with the Army of the Potomac. So he really didn't have to study naval strategy and tactics. It was pretty well in hand.
Well, of course, Winfield Scott came up with the Anaconda Plan right off the bat. How good a plan was that? Was it the right approach? And what was the overall federal naval plan after that?
Well, the Anaconda Plan, which called for the creation of a blockade to seal the Confederacy off from the sea and to send a combined force, naval and army, down the Mississippi River to seal off most of the Confederacy by land, was basic to Union strategy for the entire war, especially the naval strategy. And they were quite successful in carrying it out, especially, of course, gaining control of the Mississippi River and its tributaries. The blockade, of course, I argue in this book, was instrumental ultimately in helping the Union to win the war, even though most of the blockade running ships that tried to get through the blockade did in fact get through the blockade. Nevertheless, the blockade did cut down the Confederacy's access to the world by a huge amount. And I think in the end, the Navy carried out the Anaconda Plan with, of course, the help of the Army in the Mississippi River campaigns, capture of Vicksburg, for example, or Fort Donelson. Those were combined operations, and others as well. But that alone wouldn't have been enough to win the war. I think Lincoln came to see pretty early that in order to win the war, it was not just enough to follow Scott's recommendation to shut the Confederacy off, or at least cut back its access to the world. You were going to have to invade and conquer Confederate territory. You were going to have to cripple or destroy Confederate armies. You were going to have to destroy the infrastructure of the Confederacy to win the war. That took more than just a blockade and took more than just gaining control of the river network.
What was the international law on blockadings? You state that the U.S. treated the Confederacy as a belligerent power, but not as a nation. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Well, back in 1856, the principal maritime powers of the world had gotten together and had come up with what was called the Declaration of Paris. The conference was held in Paris. It outlawed privateering, and for that reason, the United States refused to sign the Declaration of Paris, because the United States looked toward the possibility of authorizing privateers in future wars, as they had done in the Revolution and the War of 1812. But it also said that paper blockades were illegal, that a blockade to be recognized under international law had to be sufficient really to restrict access to enemy ports. When the Civil War began and Lincoln declared a blockade because there weren't enough ships to make it really efficient at first, the Confederacy charged that it was a mere paper blockade and therefore illegal under international law, and tried to persuade the British, especially, and the French and other powers, not to respect the blockade, not to recognize it. But the British, for two reasons, I think. One, they depended on blockades in their wars and didn't want to set a precedent that could be used against them in some future war by declaring the Union blockade illegal because it wasn't sufficiently rigorous and sufficiently tight. But second, the blockade by 1862 had become restrictive enough to persuade the British, and to especially persuade Lord John Russell, the British Foreign Secretary, that it did fit the requirement of the Declaration of Paris, although he added his own corollary. We might call it the Russell corollary to the Declaration of Independence. If the blockade was sufficient really to restrict access to the court or to create an evident danger for ships trying to get through the blockade, then it was sufficient for the British to recognize it. And certainly the Union blockade created a danger for any ship trying to get through it, even though most of them did in fact make it through.
The blockade runners were, well, they had successes. Running the blockade, they were sophisticated and lucrative vessels, as you mentioned. What were their various techniques to evade?
They would wait to go out or to come in at night, and only when there was no moon, or when the moon had set or before it rose, or if it was stormy or cloudy. So they would wait until it was pitch dark. There were coded signals from on shore for incoming blockade runners to help them navigate the way in. They were painted gray for low visibility against the sea or against the background of land. They had underwater escape valves so that the escape of the steam could not be heard at any distance. They had retractable smokestacks so that they were almost invisible on a dark night and almost silent on a dark night. So they could go sometimes within a couple of 100 yards of a blockade ship and not even be seen or heard. They were also fast. By 1863, British shipyards were building specially designed blockade runners for speed and stealth. Before that time, adventurers who wanted to run a blockade would buy the fastest ship they could find, sometimes as fast as 15 or 16 knots. The ship that became the USS Gettysburg, which had been, as a blockade runner, called the Margaret and Jessie, was one of the fastest ships in the world at the time. It made 16 knots, which doesn't sound like much today, but that was fast in 1863.
You speak about the experience in the book is fascinating, the experience of being in a blockade runner. Some of them thought they were exciting affairs, but you did mention a woman who was going through, and she had wounded her pride. It was wounded pride for her to seek protection of the night, to have to go in and out. But it was meaningful to the South to have these blockade runners in and out.
Well, The South, for foreign exchange, depended on the export of cotton. In the last 4 antebellum years, they had probably exported about 12 million bales of cotton. 12 million bales of 12,000, I'm sorry, bales of cotton. I hope I have my statistics right here. I can look it up in the book. But,
I'll look it up.
yeah. In any case, during the 4 years of the Civil War, they managed to get out only about 1/10 of the it's million. I'm talking about million.
Cotton.
Yeah, cotton. They only managed to get out about 1 million bales.
Yeah, that's way down.
Way down. They used the proceeds of this cotton to buy arms, ammunition, shoes, clothing, everything that a Confederacy would, a wartime nation would need. But the blockade runners also brought in a lot of consumer goods, coffee when they could get it, fine wines and whiskey and liquor and hoop skirts and so on. And there was a lot of complaint about that in the Confederacy, that these consumer goods made more money for the blockade runners, most of whom until 1864 were actually private enterprise blockade runners. Confederate states and the Confederate government and Navy Department and Ordnance Department began purchasing or leasing their own blockade runners by 1863 or 1864, and the Confederate Congress also passed legislation requiring private blockade runners to reserve at least half of their cargo capacity for government goods. But blockade private entrepreneurs like to bring in luxury goods if they could, because that made more money for them.
I'm sure it did. Here I'm showing one of the finest copies I've had of Thomas Sharp's book on the Confederate Navy that he wrote later on, and he has a wonderful gold leaf on the front showing the Alabama, and I don't know if you've seen that. There it is, just so you can see it real quickly. And tell us a bit about the battle in international waters out there, and how the Confederacy was able to do as well as they did out there with not being under the British aegis to say, yes, we love you and here are all the ships. They had to get them out of there. And it wasn't easy to do that. I know you speak about how the federal government was trying to stop that from happening. Tell us about the international waters.
Well, the Confederacy, when the war began, gave Jefferson Davis the power to issue letters of marque to privateers. And in the first several months of the war, a number of privateers, that is, ships that had this letter of marque, that could go out and then capture American merchant ships and bring them into port and confiscate their goods. But as the blockade grew stronger, the Union blockade, it was almost impossible for the privateers to bring their captured ships into ports. And foreign powers had declared their neutrality in this war, and as a consequence, they closed their ports to the privateers. So by August or so of 1861, the privateers had pretty much disappeared from the ocean, and the Confederacy embarked instead on commerce raiders, naval ships with an official naval commission officered by Confederate naval officers that went out on the high seas and captured American merchant ships. But because they could not bring them into Confederate ports through the blockade very, very easily, in fact, it was virtually impossible to do so by 1862, and because foreign ports like Nassau in the Bahamas or Havana in Cuba would not admit them, having declared their neutrality, they burned the ships. The first of the commerce raiders was the CSS Sumter, which went out of New Orleans, escaped through the blockade, and started burning American merchant ships in the summer of 1861. It eventually broke down and was blockaded in on the Mediterranean. at Gibraltar, actually. In the meantime, the Confederate government sent James Bullock to England to sign contracts to build warships that would be effective commerce raiders. And he contracted for the construction at the Laird shipbuilding firm in Liverpool, England, of what became the CSS Florida, and most famous of all, the CSS Alabama, both of which escaped British clutches in 1862 as a violation of Britain's Own Neutrality Act, but they got out, and began raising havoc on the high seas by capturing American merchant ships, taking all the cargo from it that they could use for themselves, and then burning them. And this became the Confederacy's principal naval weapon. Altogether, there were about a dozen such commerce raiders during the course of the war. The Alabama was the most famous. The Alabama alone captured and sank, I think, 64 American merchant ships, the Florida about 38. But altogether, these 12 Confederate commerce raiders captured about 250 American merchant ships. It basically drove the American merchant marine off the high seas. It forced them into foreign registry. And the American merchant marine never fully recovered from that after the Civil War. Before the Civil War, the American merchant marine was second only to Britain in international shipping, and it never achieved that status again after the Civil War.